This land is your land. This land is my land. This is Canada, our home and native land. We live, work, and play in world-class cities. We explore and discover magnificent natural wonders. This is a country we can take pride in. But what does it mean to be a part of this country? What does it mean to be a Canadian? How do we find connection and belonging in a land so large and so diverse? We are a nation of nations whose ancestors came here from around the world. With our families, among our friends, in our communities, at our schools, in our workplaces, we see diversity as our strength. Multiculturalism has become our national ethos, and yet, we may still wonder, how do we become Canadian? Who gets to be Canadian? And who is excluded? Is this your land? Is this my land? This is Canada, our home on native land.
Okay, I think a lot of Canadians have a lot to be proud of, but we also have a lot to hide. And the reality that many Canadians don't understand or can't accept is that the country is still existing on occupied Indigenous lands. Settler colonialism isn't a historic event. It's a structure, and the structure continues to sustain and affects the lives of all people in Canada.
Through conversations with non-Indigenous Canadians, we wanted to explore how Canada's education system creates and enforces Canadian identity. How do we actually view Canada, both during our education and afterwards? How have current events and the things we see on the news changed or altered our views? How has our identity as Canadians and as settlers been dialectically constructed in relation to Indigenous people? Is being Canadian, whatever that could mean, an intrinsic part of who we are? Or has it been created to legitimize and enforce the existence of Canada on Indigenous land?
It comes naturally to think of ourselves as Canadians, but rarely do we question what it means to assume such an identity. How and why did Canadians come to exist as a people?
Education can help create a sense of belonging and connect us to each other. Identity can be where we find commonality, but it can also be used to exclude. Not only to exclude people, but also their knowledge, their history, their worldview, their experiences, their emotions, their desires.
In a settler colonial state like Canada, education, I guess the narratives we tell, the histories we recall, even the rhetoric we use, it all has a purpose at the end, and both, whether it's intentional or unintentional.
There is no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom.
I think that the portrayal of Indigenous people in my education was very much so attributing them to a point in history and that they didn't exist anymore and the problems that we created for them no longer existed. They were very much so looked at as a historical fact and no longer a current issue for Canadians. And we were not really educated on how much we as settlers and we as colonizers impacted them now in the present as much as
the Canadian educational system briefly talks about the First Nations just as a stepping stone to what the white people did in the country. So I don't think they are portrayed fairly.
It's portrayed, but we do learn a lot about it, but it's very biased. I really feel like it's on the Canadian side, the colonialists, as in terms of residential schools, we barely learn anything of that. We instead learn about how when the Europeans first came to Canada, how they were on good terms with the First Nation people and the fur trade and all that. but we never really learned much about the dark past that everyone should know about.
Like they were portrayed, but not in any sort of positive or negative light. They were just like unimportant. Like they just happened to be there and
very passively, like as if it was like it never felt important. Everything was very like pushed under the table, and it wasn't ever about them. When it came to Indigenous people, it just how shitty colonizers behaved, and like there was still not the good stuff on their part. It was always just like, okay, the colonizer did something bad, which we know. It's good that we have this information, but like there's still never the positive light. Like what did they contribute? Never. What did they bring to the society?
In Quebec, I don't remember learning about Indigenous people at all. In Saskatchewan, a bit more, but I still learned it from a white man's perspective. We were still reading, Canadian textbooks, and I was being taught by a white teacher. So
in elementary school, I did learn quite a bit about Indigenous culture throughout elementary school, and I think especially grade 3, but you don't learn much about colonialism in general. You're just learning about like their culture, and you don't understand. So you learn things like, oh, this is a wampum belt, this would be a powwow, these are the languages that the Indigenous people in this region speak, this is where they live, like this is how they would have lived pre European contact. But like in elementary school, especially, like the context is missed.
It was like about the way they talked about Indigenous people was always and only in relation to the fur trade. So that's it. It was like unimportant actors pretty much that were just there to help with the trade. It was just very matter of factly.
Like adequate in terms of the Canadian viewpoint, but I don't feel like it was adequate in terms of like a viewpoint of a First Nations that was living in Canada during the time.
So it was positive in that I had the opportunity to learn about them, but I think that a lot of important and key factors of their culture and history, past and present, was omitted.
I'd definitely start teaching it from a younger age, and having Indigenous people teach us their side of the story, because right now we are a little bit teaching it, but it's still from the colonizer's point of view.
There are a lot more narratives that is not said. There are a lot more feelings that are not felt, a lot more stories that were not said.
Comfortable a lot, yeah, because like there's many instances where they showed us pictures or videos or interviews with the former residential school survivors, right?
Yeah.
And it made me really feel bad for them and almost guilty in a way, yeah.
In high school, as your first understanding of those things, does make you feel guilty. And learning about the treaty system, all of that, you question why should I be where I am and have the life I have, and other people don't have this life.
I don't think I felt guilty, but definitely uncomfortable, because I am profiting of this. The guilt.
Definitely. Again, more recently, not so much in school, because you don't get it from a guilt narrative in school. So now that we're finding out really what happens, definitely, and knowing that my family came here as settlers, maybe they didn't participate in, the genocide, but them coming here was part of that, and it hurts to think about.
I would say yes, that it made me feel both guilty and uncomfortable, but I think that that's not a bad thing. We live on this land by their invitation, and not because it's our land, and so it should make me uncomfortable to know that everything I have is because of colonial exploitation of Indigenous people. And I guilty in the sense, not that I feel that I owe them what I have now, but guilty in the sense that I need to support Indigenous communities through my actions and through my work.
I say a lot of the junior high curriculum at the time that I was speaking to earlier, was that. Like, it was very much like settler-colonialism happened, and like we are the product of settler-colonialism, and bad things happened to them, the Indigenous people. And like learning about the history of like Europeans arriving in Canada was very much like Canada's history, and then Indigenous history was like a separate thing you learned about in elementary school, and like that's what happened to them. So it was very like us them sort of narrative.
I guess this just brings me back to discussions where it is the English and French, and then you want to take land from the Indigenous people in which they are portrayed and seen as the enemy. So
they build their identity like in contrast to what it means to be a settler or what it means to be Canadian. And
yeah, like as I said before, I feel like we are taught their history as the white man, and we came across them and we gave them this and they gave us that. It was very much an us them.
Yeah, Canadian identity is a bit weird because I don't know if I really have a definition or an understanding of Canadian identity. And usually when people try to define Canadian identity for me or to me, I don't particularly like the definition. So yeah, I would have to say I don't really have a definition of Canadian identity. I don't know what it means to be Canadian.
Yes, but not through our education system. It's more recently the news articles coming out about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I don't remember learning about that in school. The unmarked graves at all the residential schools. Don't remember learning about that in school.
Yeah, it's a lesser link, right? Because there's like a horrible past, and I really don't feel like I don't want to identify with that past, right?
Yeah,
I don't want to have anything to do with it because it's horrible.
Mm-hmm. It made me like hate it so much. It made me just like not identify as one. I just like feel extra like a side character that's here not by choice.
And I think that a lot of the atrocities committed to them were very much so minimized in our history classes, in our social studies classes, in order to give a more positive view of the Canadian identity and how we interacted with Indigenous people in settler colonial times.
Many instances, like especially social studies class, where we would talk about Canada's pluralism and multiculturalism, and that made me feel proud because I'm living in a country that accepts many people, no matter their background, right?
A lot of memes about like Canada and the States, and Canada was always like portrayed as this like better place to be in than the United States, and it was always like, oh, we're so much like better and like our free universal healthcare. So I guess I really had this idea that, oh my God, it's amazing, and like it's cool being Canadian is cool, but
definitely at the beginning of every school day we would sing "Oh Canada," so that would really instill pride in us. And I don't have any specific examples, but every class that we were taught from a Canadian perspective, so it just reinforced that we're Canadians.
Yeah, a lot of people say that Canada is a melting pot of culture, so that in itself really mentions how diversified what a Canadian youth should look like. That in itself makes me feel that I am welcome. It makes me feel that I do belong here because...
Yes, I think around grade 6 education, where they started talking about multiculturalism and how Canada had a lot of people from different cultures, it made me proud at that time with the knowledge that I had.
Yes and no. One, we're living under the rule of like the European colonialists right now, who actually basically built Canada. But at the same time, I do sort of identify that term because it's not our land, right? It's the land of the First Nations. And
yeah, I do identify as a settler. I am not from here. I am an immigrant. So yes.
Yes, as a non-Indigenous person living in Canada, I am a settler. And I have made this land my home, even though it's not my land. So I identify with the term settler.
Well, if I did consider myself Canadian, I was a white Canadian. So I guess, yeah, I would consider myself at least half settler for sure.
I think it has like impacted my understanding definitely of like, yeah, how I identify. I still obviously identify as a Canadian, but there's much, and although I do view that there's aspects of that identity that are worthwhile to like, I don't even know if proud is the word, but to like celebrate some aspects of, although I don't even know what Canadian identity is what I said, but there's still much of it that I'm like skeptical of. And as I said, that the greater understanding that's come from after K-12 education about how like the Canadian state continues to other Indigenous people and like use practices of colonialism to this day, and like the treatment of Indigenous people currently, I think like I try to own as part of being like a settler in Canada more so than I would have previously, and like hopefully try to own that like this is our collective issue as settlers in Canada to deal with, rather than being like, oh, that happened in the past, and like now we've moved on, which is what they basically give you in K-12.
It came to a point where looking at the Canadian flag and listening to the anthem made me realize that it's not worth it to be part of that type of gathering.
Well, in the beginning, I really never knew much about them because we were only taught that they lived here before, but then they're always on good terms with the Europeans. But then around when grade 10, when I've actually started researching the past and the residential school system and all that, my view has really changed from when I was like younger till now.
Absolutely. So since the end of my grade 12 education, I think I view Canadian history and present Canadian society a lot more negatively. I think that we pretend to be multicultural and accepting of all people when in reality we're not. And we have massive issues with systemic racism against not only just people of color, but especially Indigenous people. And
over the past decade, my Canadian pride has really diminished. I still appreciate what I was brought up with in Canada, because I know other countries don't offer what Canada can offer. But yeah, no, I don't walk around with my Canadian flag with the pride I used to anymore, for sure.
100%. And it's like very much based off the fact that like I myself am Palestinian, and I had to realize like that we're not alone, and like where we are, there's the same problems, if not worse, happening. Like because I'm a Palestinian, I got to learn, and I got interested, and I read books, and I've like a lot of it from social media to like that instigated want to learn as well. If it weren't for social media and like people in our generation like actually talking about it, I don't think we would ever hear anything still to this day, and that's the most disgusting part.
It's changed the way I view it. Like I don't see it as like this great place to be in anymore. I just see it as like just another extension of like, you know, of the powers that be, I guess.
I guess it is just a nationality at this point for me. I am not inclined to go up there and say I'm Canadian and proud to be Canadian. Yeah.
I'm not really sure what I should think about being Canadian, and I'm not super proud of Canada anymore.
Yeah, 100%. Like it comes back to the Palestinian topic as well. Like it made me like lose hope in this country.
Because with my education in terms of the discovery of these like unmarked graves, especially of all of last year, when it was like every single day a new residential school would come into light with a bunch of unmarked graves, it really made me feel bad as a Canadian. Like my identity was different from maybe like 2 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Because I feel like there's something we should do. There's something we have to do to achieve this collective society where everyone is living together. But with respect with one another.
Okay, yeah, right. So I tend to think that like Canadians are portrayed or thought about as being like, you know, these like chopping wood and loving beavers and drinking beer and wearing like the red flannel shirts, whatever. And I don't know, I used to kind of think that, oh, like that's the cool Canadian identity, but obviously learning about like Indigenous history and Canadian history, you know, I feel that that's like a really, again, like a superficial representation, right? And which purposefully ignores like what it actually means to be Canadian. So yeah, it definitely has. Where like I used to, like I said, I used to think that this was Canadian identity and this was cool, and now I see it as like, oh, well, yeah, you know, you're just willfully ignorant. So
I think in my idea of Canadian identity, I would like to say that they're a central part of what I think Canada is. So I know I said I'm from Calgary, but I'm also from Mohkinstsis, which is the Indigenous word for where I live. And I think that that is a central part of incorporating Indigenous culture and knowledge into my own personal identity as a Canadian.
I think today we can see from Turtle Island to Palestine and beyond, Indigenous and racialized people continue to fight all forms of oppression while also searching for belonging and recognition within societies. The people in settler colonial states, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are starting to question more and more the stories, the truths that we've been told and that are created around us.
As more diverse voices are heard, the narratives and logics that uphold oppression and marginalization deserve critical analysis and reimagining.
I don't know if I really have a definition or an understanding of Canadian identity.
It should make me uncomfortable to know that everything I have is because of colonial exploitation of Indigenous people.
I don't walk around with my Canadian flag with the pride I used to anymore.
We're living on these people's land, and we never really gave them much compensation.
You know, you question, like, why should I be where I am and have the life I have, and other people don't have this life?
Like every capitalist country tends to do, right? Like the commodification of identity.
We're not asking for like all these immigrants and whatever, anyone to leave this land. Like they're asking for us to respect it. They want to take care of the land. We want to exploit it.
I just realize more and more, and as I grow older as well, how quickly people tend to forget things.
We are the product of study of colonialism, and bad things happen to them, the Indigenous people.
And they never taught us what we should really know in terms of the real past, what happened to these people.
There are a lot more narratives that is not said. There are a lot more feelings that are not felt, a lot more stories that were not said.
We cannot know yet how we will identify in a decolonized world, but we can start by questioning our identity today.
The way that we teach and learn or transmit and produce knowledge needs to be challenged and interrogated and freed of the racist beliefs and worldviews that they have been constructed from. If we fail to do so, we perpetuate and legitimize the continuity of settler colonialism.
We can question how and why we feel Canadian. We can question how our identity is created and then used for political aims. And then those of us who do have a decolonial vision for Canada's future must ask whether our identity as Canadians is beneficial or a hindrance to a truly transformative reimagining and radical reconceptualization of our society.
As a settler colonial state, Canada is a place full of transformative potential and creative possibilities, precisely because decolonization has yet to occur.
Decolonization is the process whereby we intend the conditions we want to live and social relations we wish to have. Decolonization requires us to exercise our sovereignties differently and reconfigure our communities based on shared experiences, ideals, and visions.